The my.user object returns information about the current user. So the name property will give me the name of the user. IsAuthenticated will return true if the user has been authenticated. I can find out what roles the user's in by using isInRole. And finally, the current principal represents the security context the user is currently running in. So when I log on to the computer as AppDevUser, my.user.name will return that. And then if I successfully log in, then I'm authenticated. So let's go see an example of using my.user. Here's the main form of the My Namespace application. I'll click my.user and we'll bring up the my.user form, and when I click user information, I'm going to see the username, user01, which is the name of the computer, and then AppDevUser, that's who I've logged in as. Current principal is principal object, and it represents the security context I'm running in. So current principal.identity is me, and therefore the name is the same. I'm authenticated, and I'm an administrator. Here's the code for this. We're going to display my.user.name and then my.user.currentprincipal.identity.name. So that's the name of the user and the name of the user's current principal. So because this application uses Windows authentication, my.user.name and my.user.currentprincipal.identity.name are the same. But if I was using custom security, and for example I was logging in as guest or admin, then they would be different. I'm checking to see if I'm authenticated, and then I'm checking to see if I'm an administrator. So my.user.isInRole administrators returns true because I am in the administrators group. So my.user gives you easy access to information about the current user. My.forms is a collection object, and the collection is a collection of forms in the project. This is not the same as my.application.openForms, which is the forms that are currently open when the application's running. My.forms will be a collection of all of the forms that are in the actual project. Properties and methods of the form class are also, all of the properties and methods of the form class are available through my.forms. And the nice thing about my.forms is you can access a form without having to instantiate it first. Let's go see how. I have several forms in the My Namespace project, and the main form has buttons to call most of them. So for example, when I click my.application, I want to run the my.application form, and when I click my.computer, I want to run the myComputerForm form. So let's switch to code view and see what's happening here. Now ordinarily, prior to my.forms, I would create a private variable up here called form, and I would set it equal to an instance of the form class, and I would probably set it equal to nothing. And then when I click the My Application button, when I click the my.application button, I'd set form equal to a new instance of My Application Form, which of course is a class, and then I would call the show method on that. And I would do that for every one of my forms. But because I have a collection called my.forms, I don't need to write any of that code. My.forms.myApplicationForm is an instance of the myApplicationForm class. And therefore, all I need to do is call show on it. So I can type my.forms. And here's a list of all of the forms in the project. So all I need to do is come down and select a form, and then I have access to all of the properties, including show. So with a single line of code, and without having to instantiate the form classes, I can just bring up forms. So let's see a couple other examples. In the my.forms form, when I click show forms, I'm going to open form 1, then 2, then 3. Then I'm going to close them all. Alright, so what did that do other than show us pretty pictures? So when I click show forms, I'm going to show the first form, the second form, and the third form. They're named myForms 1, myForms 2, and myForms 3. And then I'm going to close them all by calling the close method. So this is to show you that I have access to the form methods. I also have access to form properties. The My Computer form is not currently open, but I can still read its text and start position and any other properties. Here, all I need is my.forms.mycomputerform.text, and it's as if I've instantiated that form. And what's literally happening is I am instantiating an instance of that form and then reading the text and the start position property. I just don't have to explicitly instantiate it. My.forms.mycomputerform does that for me. So my.forms doesn't give you additional functionality, it just means you get to type less code. My.resources provides access to the resources in a project. Resources are strings, images, icons, audio files, additional files such as text files or XML files. And you can add resources on the resources page of the project designer, and then once you've added a resource to the project, you can easily work with it in code by using my.resources. Settings are properties of the application that are either application level or user level, and these can be accessed at runtime using my.settings. Now, application level settings are read-only at runtime. This would be a good place to store folders or connection strings, things that are going to be set once and then used throughout the application. User level settings are associated with the current user and can be modified at runtime. So things like preferences, what font does the user want, what background color, etc. And each user will have their own set of settings. You create the application level settings and the default values for the user level settings in the settings page of the project designer. And then once you've added settings to a project, you can use them in code through my.settings. So let's go take a look at using my.resources and my.settings. Let's go take a look at the project level properties for the My Namespace project. And specifically, let's look at resources and settings. Resources can be images, strings, icons, audio files, text files, XML files, etc. And in this project I have two images that are resources, two versions of the AppDev logo. I also have an audio file, which is Soda. And I put these at the application level, and that gives me the ability to use them anywhere in the application. When the form loads, I'm going to set the image of this picture box, and then when I click Change Image, I want to change that image. And when I click Play Sound, I'm going to use mycomputer.audio.play to play that Soda file. So let's look at the code. In the load, I'm going to set the image property of the picture box to appdev_t logo, which is, go back to the images, this. Resources are stored in the resources folder on the project, so they're actually on disk. I don't want to have to know what folder they're in on the disk. The users could move them, could delete them. That's fairly brittle code. By adding it as a resource to the project, I know that this file is going to be built into the project and will always be available. And I can call it by saying my.resources. And then using IntelliSense to pick off the name. So my.resources. There are the two AppDev logos and Soda. When I click the Change Image button, I'm going to set the image property of the picture box to a different resource, my.resources.appdev175. And when I click the Play Sound button, I want to play that Soda wave file. My.computer.audio.play will play the sound, and the first argument is what wave file to play. Again, I don't have to hard-code a path, I just reference the Soda resource. And then I'm going to have the code pause until that sound plays. So let's run this application and work with the resources. I'll click my.resources, and in the load, the picture box's image is set to one of the AppDev logos. And when I click Change Image, it changes. And when I click Play Sound, I'll play that Soda wave file, and the application will pause until it's done playing. So it's easy to work with resources in code because they're properties of the resources object. And the same thing applies for settings. Let's go back into the Project Designer and go to Settings. So here I have a number of settings set in this project, 2 at the application level and 4 at the user level. At the application level I have a connection string, Northwind connection string, which is of type connection string, so it's automatically at the application level, can be read but not changed at runtime. And if I want to change this, I click the ellipsis. That brings up the connection properties dialog, and I can connect to a database. I also have a setting for a web service, and we're going to look at that in the next demo. Then I have 2 sets of city and state settings. AppDev City and AppDev State are set to Eden Prairie and Minnesota, which of course is where AppDev is. And then I want the user to be able to set their city and state. I'll default those to Eden Prairie and Minnesota because they need to default to something, but I'm going to let the user change these. Okay, so let's go into the My Settings form, and I'm going to display the AppDev City and the AppDev State in the upper left of the form, and I'm going to display your city and your state in the upper right, but that's going to be in a text box. Therefore, it can be changed. When I click Update, I'm going to be able to save my version of the city and state setting. And then when I click the Settings button, I'm going to display all of the settings in this list box. So let's run this. I'll click My.Settings, and in the upper left I see the AppDev City and the AppDev State, in the upper right My City and My State, and that defaults to Eden Prairie and Minnesota. So let's look at the code in this form. When the code loads, I'm going to set the value of the AppDev City label's text property to my.settings.appdevcity, and do the same thing for the AppDev State label. And then I'll set the text in the city and the state text box to my.settingsuserCity and my.settingsuserState. Okay, well now, as much as I love coming to Eden Prairie, I don't actually live here, so I'm going to enter my city and my state and then update these settings. So I'm going to set my.settings.userCity equal to what I entered in the city text box and my.settings.userState equal to what I entered in the state text box, and then I'm going to save those settings. Then I'm going to display the settings in this list box. The AppDev City setting is still at Eden Prairie. Here's the Northwind connection string, which is a connection string to the database. My namespace underscore numbers underscore numbers, that's a setting for a web service. The user city and the user state have changed to Redmond and Washington, and the AppDev State is still at Minnesota. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to loop through my.settings.properties, and that's a collection of system.configuration.settings property. So PRP will represent each setting. Then I'm going to get the name of each setting and its value. So my.settings.property values, and then when I pass PRP.name to that, that gets me a reference to that property, and then the value is property value. So this is a reference to the value of a particular property, and I'm going to display the name of the property and its value in this list box. One last thing to mention on settings. This line of code, my.settings.save, is actually redundant in this application. And that's because VB, by default, saves settings when you close the application. But I've put that code in there not only to show you how, but because you can turn off that setting. So you set resources and settings at the application level in the Project Designer, and then you can easily work with them in your code through my.resources and my.settings. The final object in the My namespace that we want to look at is My.WebServices. And My.WebServices is a collection object, and it's going to contain an instance of each web service that you've defined in the project. So the best way to think of a web service is that it's basically an assembly running on a web server somewhere. It's a class library assembly, and so there's a class, and that class has methods. And what you want to do is call methods of that class, but it doesn't exist on your computer. It may not even exist on your network. You may get it over the internet. And the nice thing about web services is that it gives you the ability to call code running on a different computer, and then you use XML to send data and receive data. So when you want to work with a web service, you'll set a reference to it in your project. And after you've done that, that web service is represented as a property of the My.WebServices object. And the name of the property is the same as the name of the web service. Now when you add a reference to a web service, Visual Studio creates a proxy class. And the reason it does that is because there's a fair amount of plumbing code required to talk to a web service, pass it data, and receive that data. So Visual Studio creates that proxy class for you, and then you can use that proxy class in your code to call methods of the web service. But My.WebServices gives you another level of abstraction because you don't even need to create an instance of the proxy class. So let's go see how that works. Let's run the My namespace application and see a use of web services. So if I come down to the My.WebServices form, I'm going to be able to convert a number to text. So if I click this button, Convert Number to Text, it'll take the 123.45 in that text box and convert it to text, 123 and 45/100ths. Now the code to do this converting is not on this computer. It's actually in a web service running on another website. So before you can use a web service, you need to add it to your application. And the way you add it is by right-clicking and then choosing either web reference or service reference. And there's actually a difference. So if you've never added a reference to a web service before, you won't have an Add Web Reference choice on this pop-up menu. So what you would do is select Add Service Reference. And this brings up the Add Service Reference dialog, which can be used to add a reference to either a web service or a Windows Communication Foundation service. Well, what you can do here is enter the address of the web service. So this Convert to Text web service we're using is on www.mcwtech.com/webservices/numbers.asmx. And now when I click Go, Visual Studio will contact that web service to see if it's available. It is, so I can select Numbers, and I can rename it because Service Reference 1 is a bit of a generic name, so I'm going to call this Numbers Service. And now I'll click OK, and Visual Studio creates the proxy class Numbers Service, and this proxy class contains all the code I need to talk to that web service. Now if you've used Visual Studio 2005, you don't have a Service References dialog. That was added in 2008. And you might be familiar with, I guess, what we'll call the old way of adding web references. So if you want to do that, you can select Add Service Reference, click Advanced, then in the bottom here click Add Web Reference, and here's the same dialog that you would use in Visual Studio 2005 to add a web reference. So again, we can type www.mcwtech.com web services numbers.asmx and click Go. And this gives us the more familiar dialog with the test page. I can click num2str, which is the method in there, and then I could click here to see the WSTL, the Web Service Description Language, and then rename the web reference. Now I already have a reference to this, so if I add a second reference to the same web service, it'll probably mess up my code, so I'm going to cancel out of here. So I have a service reference and a web reference, and just to be on the safe side, I'm going to get rid of the service reference. I don't trust multiple references to the exact same thing, and I know that with this web service reference the code works. Okay, so the code that I'm talking about is in the My Web Services form. And when I click on Convert Number to Text, I want to call that web service. Now without my.webservices, I would need to do this. I need a reference to the proxy class, which is numbers_webservice.numbers. So I would create an instance of that, numbers service, and then I would call numbers service.num to str and pass in whatever the user entered. But with my.webservices, I don't need to do that because my.webservices dot gives me a reference to that web service. So again, as with all of the other my examples, less code I need to write. Because now my.webservices.numbers contains all of the methods in that web service, num to str, and then I just pass what the user entered as a decimal, and I get back text. So throughout these examples with the number one takeaway is less code.